The morning they brought the green-eyed child into Precinct 9, Sergeant Delamaro was drinking cold coffee and pretending to fill out a use-of-force report. She'd been pretending for 3 days. There was a difference between filling out the form and just staring at it while her mind played back the alley on Korath Street, the way the Sheth warrior had moved, and the reason her partner was now missing 4 inches of his left forearm. The bullpen of Precinct 9 ran on a particular kind of organized noise, the kind that newer officers found overwhelming and veterans stopped hearing within the first year. Phones, boots on tile. The mechanical complaint of the booking system's printer, which had been complaining in the same way for 11 years, and which maintenance had looked at 4 times and declared not broken, simply unhappy. Across the bullpen from Della's desk, 2 detectives from the settlement division were having an argument about jurisdictional boundaries that had started, as near as she could tell, sometime during the previous administration. The argument was slow and ritualized, like a liturgy. Neither of them was listening to the other. Neither of them expected resolution. They would argue about it again tomorrow. Della drank her coffee. On the form in front of her, the question she'd been unable to get past for 3 days read, described the immediate circumstances that necessitated the use of force. She'd written and deleted the same sentence 9 times. The sentence was, "I don't know what the circumstances were. I knew what I was looking at, but I didn't know what I was seeing. There is a difference." She deleted it a 10th time. The child was small. That was the first thing Della noticed when Officer Tren Vasic walked him through the bullpen door. Children from the outer settlements tended to run small, malnutrition, mostly, combined with whatever chemical residue still leaked from the Drith refineries along the eastern settlement boundary. The refineries had been there as long as anyone could remember. The health statistics around them had been there just as long. The city knew about the statistics. The city had written reports about the statistics. The reports were very thorough and had accomplished very little, which was also a statistic, one nobody wrote reports about. But this boy was small in a particular way, a compressed kind of small, like something that had been squeezed until all the excess was gone and only the essential remained. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old. His skin was the gray-green of old moss, slightly lighter at the jaw and the backs of his hands. His ears were flattened back against his skull, the way young orcs did when they were afraid and trying not to show it. He was carrying what looked like a stone tablet pressed against his chest, both arms wrapped around it as though it were cold and he were warming it. And his eyes. She noticed the eyes from across the bullpen. Even through the noise and the distance and the ordinary visual clutter of a precinct in operation, she noticed them. Green, not the amber yellow that orc eyes came in, not even the rare gray-brown that occasionally showed up in the hill clans. Pure green, the color of deep water seen from above, the color of old glass, the color of a particular mineral she'd once seen in a geology display at the Settlement Museum, and could not afterward remember the name of. She'd read about it once, in an anthropological pamphlet distributed to officers working the outer settlements as part of the cultural competency package that nobody read. Green eyes in an orc child were said to appear roughly once in 30,000 births. The blooded clans considered it either a blessing or a curse, depending on which elder you asked, and how many seasons had passed since the last bad harvest. Officer Vasic brought the boy in by the wrist, which wasn't regulation and wasn't kind, but Vasic wasn't known for either quality. He'd been working the settlement boundary for 4 years and had arrived at his opinions about the outer settlements on his first week and had not revised them since. This was, as far as Della could tell, an occupational strategy. It was not a good one, but it was common. Vasic dropped a paper evidence bag on the intake counter and said, "Found him in the ruins off Sutter Market. Alone. No identification. No family marker. Carrying this." The intake officer, a bored woman named Chull who had seen most things and was impressed by none of them, looked in the bag. She didn't touch what was inside. She studied it for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing their assumptions about the day. She called Morrow over. Della looked in the bag. The tablet the boy had been carrying was stone, gray-black and smooth, about the size of a large hardback book, covered in orc script that she couldn't read. The script was old, not the simplified trade orc that settlement officers learned in their first month, but something older, denser. The characters carved so precisely and so deeply that the stone had cracked along the central axis under the force of whatever tool had made them. On one face of the tablet, pressed into the stone so deep it had cracked the material clear through, was the imprint of a handprint. The fingers were long. The thumb was cocked at an angle she'd never seen in any living orc, or any orc skeleton in any museum she'd visited. Vasek said, "Clan artifact, probably stolen, probably worth something. Run the boy through the system and call clan relations if he has a marker." "He doesn't have a marker," Della said. Family markers in the outer settlements were brands or tattoos applied in infancy, clan-specific, serving as identification, genealogical record, and territorial claim all at once. The boy's neck and wrists, the standard marker locations, were clean. "Then call the settlement office. They'll figure out which juvenile facility takes orcs." He left. That was all he had. Vasek had a threshold for complexity and the boy had exceeded it, so Vasek was done, and the boy was now a thing to be processed, and processing was someone else's department. The boy stood at the intake counter and looked at Della with those green eyes and said nothing. His wrist, where Vasek had gripped him, was reddening. Della got him a cup of water from the cooler in the corner. She set it on the counter in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment, assessing it, she thought, the way a careful person assesses something offered by a stranger, then picked it up with both hands, very precisely, and drank it in one continuous swallow without taking his eyes off her. She pulled up the intake stool and sat at his level. She said, in the pigeon orc trade that every officer in the outer settlements learned in their first month, and that covered food, directions, legal rights, and not much else. "Your name?" He said in perfect unaccented standard, "My name is Kor." She blinked. "My grandmother taught me standard," he said. "She said it would be more useful than the old tongue in the time that was coming. She said I would need to be understood." "By who?" He considered the question with a seriousness she didn't usually see in adults. "By whoever was in a position to help," he said. "She didn't know who that would be. She said I would." Della looked at him. "And do you?" The boy looked back at her with those impossible green eyes and didn't answer, which was itself a kind of answer. "What's in the time that's coming?" she said. He looked past her, at the wall of the bullpen where the city's district map was pinned between a wanted flyer and a blood bank notice. He looked at it for a long time, the way people look at maps when they're locating themselves, when they're calculating the distance between where they are and where they need to be. "The time when the banner moves," he said. Della pulled the intake stool a little closer. Behind her, Chull had already lost interest and gone back to her terminal. The bullpen noise continued around them, phones, boots on tile, the settlement division argument in its 17th iteration. Ordinary, mundane, the texture of every day. "Tell me about the banner," Della said. He told her. "There was a clan hall," he said, "in the deep settlements, past the refinery district and past the squatter camps, and past even the wild ground where nothing grew that you could eat without getting sick. The clan hall had been there since before the refineries, since before the city, since before whatever the city had been built on top of, which Kor said with a specificity that she noted and did not yet understand. The building was mostly underground now, its upper story buried under a century of settlement drift and compacted debris, accessible only through a narrow entrance in what looked, from outside, like a maintenance hatch. Inside the hall were 12 banners. 11 were battle banners, each one representing a historical clan victory, each one stitched in the old way with thread dyed from minerals found only in the deep earth, so that the colors were things you couldn't describe properly to someone who hadn't seen them, not blue or red or gold, but something adjacent to each of those colors, something that made you look twice because your brain insisted it recognized the color and your eye said it didn't. The 12th banner was not a battle banner. The 12th banner showed a child with green eyes standing in front of an open door. It had hung in the hall for 240 years without moving, without shifting, without so much as stirring in the drafts that moved through the buried hall at night, which were substantial drafts coming up from somewhere below. The elders, who took shifts sitting with the banner in the way you took shifts sitting with the very old or the very ill, had documented every day of those 240 years. The documentation filled 17 hand-copied books. Nothing had ever happened. Until 6 days ago. 6 days ago, the banner had moved. Not in a draft, not because someone touched it. It had folded itself at the center and hung differently than it had for 240 years, so that the child with green eyes was now facing something that had previously been behind the frame, something in the left side background of the image that none of the elders had thought to examine closely in 240 years of sitting with it, because the child's face had always faced away from it. Now the child faced it directly. Now you could see what it was. A door, a different door from the one the child had been standing in front of, narrower, darker, further away, and in front of this second door, pressed flat against it with both palms, the child's hands. The clan elders had spent 2 days arguing about what this meant. On the 3rd day, a Sheth raiding party had come through the settlements. Della had heard about the Sheth raids. Every officer in the city had. Intelligence reports from the Settlement Watch described a movement of Sheth warriors from the Eastern Territories, organized around a symbol that the Watch analysts couldn't identify, a 4-pointed mark pressed into wax or clay or sometimes burned into wood, found wherever the Sheth had been. The analysts thought it was a territorial marker, the kind of thing clan movements used to announce their passage and stake their claims. A few of the older settlement liaisons who'd been working the outer districts for 20 years thought it was something else, something older, and they said so in the reports. But those paragraphs tended to get cut by the time the reports reached commanders who'd never once set foot east of the refinery line. The thing about offices, Della had noticed, was that they tended to understand things in terms of the problems they were already equipped to solve. Kor's grandmother had hidden him in the long tunnels that ran under the old parts of the settlement before the raiders came through. The tunnels were pre-city, pre-settlement, older than the oldest occupied buildings, their walls made of the same gray-black stone as the tablet. She'd given Kor the tablet and told him to stay hidden for 2 days. If she didn't come back, he was to find his way to the city. She hadn't come back. So he'd found his way to the city. It had taken him 4 days. He'd eaten what he could find. He'd slept in maintenance alcoves and drainage corridors. He'd gotten through settlement boundary control by waiting for a shift change at the secondary gate and walking through with a group of settlement day workers, small enough and quiet enough to pass for a child being brought in by someone he wasn't with. He'd found the ruins off Sutter Market because his grandmother had described them as a meeting point, a place where the deep settlement clans came into the city when they needed to. He'd waited there for 2 more days. Nobody came. She said the writing explains what the banner means, Kor said. She said a human with the mark would know how to read it, or would know who could. Della looked at the boy. What mark? He looked at her left hand. She looked down at it before she could stop herself. The scar there, pale and irregular, running from the base of her thumb across the palm, she'd gotten it at 14, in a completely unmagical incident involving a broken window and a stray dog she'd been trying to rescue. The scar was shaped like nothing, like the random result of a jagged edge and panicked movement, like nothing at all. The boy looked at the scar the way he'd looked at the city map, with recognition, not like he was seeing it for the first time. Like he was confirming that it was where he'd expected to find it. Della said, "I'm going to make some calls." The calls did not go well. The settlement liaison office said the tablet was a cultural artifact that needed to go to clan relations before any human officer examined it. Clan relations said they weren't authorized to evaluate items from the deep settlement clans without a referral from settlement liaison. The Precinct 9 watch commander, Captain Brecht, said the child needed to go to juvenile processing, and the tablet needed to go to the evidence locker, and Morrow needed to finish her use of force report before she did anything else. And the way he said it communicated clearly that he considered the whole situation a nuisance that had arrived at the wrong time and would leave as soon as the proper forms had been completed. Della finished the report. She filed it. She sat at her desk for 11 minutes and thought about procedure and jurisdiction and the institutional logic that had generated the system she worked inside. A system that was very good at processing the things it was designed to process and very bad at recognizing when something fell outside the design. Then she took the tablet from the evidence bag, wrapped it in her jacket, and walked to the one person in the building who might know what the orc script said. His name was Arak Half-Tusk, and he worked the building's mail room because the Precinct 9 staffing guidelines had a provision for one non-human support employee per floor, and Arak had applied 6 years ago, and nobody else had wanted the position. He was old for an orc, old enough that he'd been born before the settlement codes were enacted, which meant he'd grown up in a time when the relationship between orc clans and the city was governed by something other than policy documents. He was large even by orc standards, his shoulders nearly touching both walls of the mail room when he stood at the sorting table, his tusks worn smooth and slightly yellowed with age. He wore a city employee badge on a lanyard around his neck and reading glasses on a second lanyard, and he was, in Della's experience, the most precisely competent person in the building. Nobody in the building knew anything about him except that he sorted the mail correctly, which was all the building required. He had a specific relationship with the old orc script that young orcs who'd grown up in the city mostly didn't have. He could read it. He read widely. He had opinions. Nobody asked for them. He read the tablet in silence, turning it in his thick hands, running one blunt finger along the carved lines. His tusks shifted slightly, the way they did when he was concentrating hard. His amber eyes moved back and forth across the stone with the particular quality of someone reading something they know, not decoding it but recognizing it, the way you recognize a voice. When he was done, he set the tablet down on the mail sorting table and looked at the wall for a long moment. "Well," Della said. "This is a fragment of the seeing record," Arak said. His voice was low and even. "I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what it says." "All right." The seeing record is a cycle of prophecy documents produced by the Deep Clan oracles between roughly 600 and 800 years ago. Most were destroyed in the clan wars of the 4th century. The remaining fragments are considered mythological by the settlement communities and by every academic institution in the city. The clans in the deep settlements do not consider them mythological. This creates a particular problem, which is that the people most equipped to evaluate the fragments consider them folklore, and the people who do not consider them folklore are not considered credible sources by any institution with the authority to act on what the fragments say. "What does this one say?" He was quiet for a moment longer. "It describes the closing of the Drith Gate." She said she didn't know what that was. Arak picked up the tablet again, turned it in his hands, set it down with the handprint facing up. "The Drith were not the first non-human species to hold this land," he said. "Before the Drith, before the orc clans, before anything you or I would recognize as history, there was something else in this region. The seeing record calls it the First Presence. The First Presence built gates, physical structures underground constructed of a material the record describes in language that translates most closely to stone that is not stone, older than the mountain. The gates connected locations across what is now the continent. When the first presence disappeared, the record is ambiguous on whether they departed voluntarily or were destroyed. The gates remained. Most of them collapsed over centuries. The Drith Gate did not collapse. Where is it? Below us, Arak said. Below the city. The refineries along the eastern settlement boundary were built where they were built because the substrata there are chemically unusual, rich in the specific minerals that refinery processing requires. Substrata are chemically unusual because of the gate. The leakage from the gate as it slowly deteriorates is what has made this region what it is. The health statistics in the outer settlements that every city report documents and no city policy adequately addresses, those statistics exist because the gate has been leaking its contents into the surrounding geology for 200 years, not toxins from industrial activity. The refineries sit where they do because the ground was already unusual. The industry followed the ground. Della sat down on a mail bin. She sat there for a moment and let the information rearrange things. And the Sheth, she said. The Sheth have served whatever is beyond the gate for a very long time, Arak said. They need the gate to remain open. They need what is beyond it to come through when the gate finally collapses completely, not leaks through, but collapses. The record describes what comes through on complete collapse in terms that do not translate cleanly into standard. The terms are all experiential rather than descriptive. They tell you what it feels like rather than what it is. What does it feel like? Ending, he said simply. Della looked at the handprint in the stone. The green-eyed child of the Moreth bloodline is, according to the seeing record, the only entity capable of closing the gate before collapse, Arak continued. Not after. The window is narrow. The record says it requires a generation of green-eyed births in the Moreth line, and then the season of the moving banner. The last green-eyed child of the Moreth line lived 240 years ago and died attempting the closing. The gate was too far open at that point. The record said to wait. It said the next green-eyed child in the Moreth line, in the season of the moving banner, would succeed. Della's hand was on the tablet before she decided to reach for it. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that didn't correspond to its size. The handprint under her palm was the wrong size for her hand, the fingers longer, the thumb angled differently. She put it back down. Where is the gate exactly? Approximately 400 meters below the foundation of this building, Arak said. He looked at her. The first presence built beneath what later became populated centers. I believe this was intentional. I believe they wanted the gates attended to. I believe they underestimated how thoroughly the populations that came after them would build institutions designed to process only what those institutions were already prepared for. Della found Kor where she'd left him, at the intake counter, sitting in the chair she'd pulled out for him. Someone had given him a second cup of water and a protein bar from the vending machine. He was eating the protein bar methodically, in small, precise bites, watching the bullpen with those green eyes that, she now noticed, missed almost nothing. He was tracking the room the way experienced officers tracked rooms. Not anxiously, but constantly, with the habitual low-level attention of someone who had learned early that knowing where things were was a form of safety. When Della came back, he looked at her and said, without preamble, "You spoke to someone who knows the old writing." "Yes. And now you believe me." It wasn't a question. She sat down across from him. "I believed you before," she said. "I just needed to know what I was believing." He finished the protein bar. He folded the wrapper into a neat square, the fold lines precise, and set it on the counter. "My grandmother prepared me for a long time," he said, "since before I was old enough to understand what she was preparing me for. She started with the history first, the first presence, the gates, the record. She said I had to understand what the gate was before I could understand why it mattered that I close it. She said most people fail at necessary things not because they lack courage, but because they lack context. They try to be brave about something they don't understand, and bravery without understanding is just movement in a direction. Della thought about this. She thought about 6 years in the outer settlements, running calls that the city processed as crime statistics and that she processed as the visible surface of invisible systems. She thought about the thing she'd said to her partner once, early on, that policing the settlements was like trying to treat symptoms without the chart. You couldn't understand what you were seeing without the history of how it had got to be what it was. She sounded like she was very specific, Della said. Yes, Core said. She was the most specific person I've ever known. She said specificity was the only tool that worked on big problems. That vague efforts at large things produced vague results. Do you know what to do, Della said, at the gate? No, he said. He said it simply, without distress. But my grandmother also said that the knowing comes at the gate. She said you don't understand a door until you're standing in front of it. She said she had studied the record for 40 years, and she still didn't know exactly what the closing would require, until the previous green-eyed child had stood at the gate, and she'd read the account of what they'd done, and why it hadn't worked. She said that the account of the failure was the clearest description she'd ever found of what success would require. And what does success require? He looked at his hands, his small gray-green hands, the palms smooth, the knuckles just slightly knobbed in the way orc children's knuckles were. The blood of the Morath line, he said, applied at the point of origin. The record is not metaphorical about this. My grandmother was very clear that it is literal blood from the palm pressed against the gate at the center point. The previous attempt failed because the gate was not ready, and because the child who tried had not understood that the gate would take what it needed, not what was offered. She said the gate knows the difference between a gift and a payment. Della looked at his hands. The print in the tablet, she said, is too large to be yours. It belonged to the child who tried 240 years ago, Core said. My grandmother said the tablet was made afterward from memory, pressed into the stone by one of the elders who had witnessed it. She said the tablet was meant as a warning and a guide at the same time. The warning being, the gate is real and it will take the blood literally. The guide being, this is what the hands should look like. She said I would be too small and that was all right. The record didn't specify size. Behind them, on the intake counter, the bullpen noise continued. The settlement division argument had moved into a new phase involving a disputed map. Chull was on the phone. The booking printer was complaining. Everything was ordinary and in motion and entirely unaware of itself. I need some things from my desk, Della said. And then we're going to need to use the maintenance tunnel access in sublevel 3, which requires a key that I have because I processed a building emergency 6 months ago and nobody asked for it back. And I need you to stay very close and do exactly what I tell you in terms of movement. And trust me on the tactical decisions because you don't have the training and I don't have the prophetic knowledge, and between us, we might be sufficient. Core looked at her. All right, he said. I also need you to understand that I have no official authority to take you anywhere, no backup that would understand what I'm trying to do, and no idea what closing a gate actually looks like in practice. My grandmother said the same thing, Core said. She said she'd prepared everything she could prepare and the rest would be improvisation, and that improvisation was not failure of preparation. It was preparation encountering reality. Della looked at him for a moment, 7 years old. Smart woman. The smartest I've known, he said. Except she also said that smart is only useful when paired with someone willing to act on it. She went to her desk. She took her service weapon, her field kit, a spare flashlight, and the building master key she'd had for 6 months. She looked at the use of force report she'd spent 3 days not completing. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she left it on the desk and went back to the intake counter. Arak met them in the parking structure. He'd pulled the building's geological survey maps from records archives, with a story about a suspected burst pipe, which was plausible enough that nobody had questioned it. He spread the maps on the hood of Della's vehicle and showed them the maintenance tunnels under the foundation layers, the access points, the places where the survey annotated anomalous formations in the substrata. There were 4 such annotations, 3 clustered under the old settlement foundations. The 4th was deeper, alone, in a region of the map where the survey line simply stopped and a note in different handwriting read, "Depth exceeded equipment tolerance, survey abandoned." Arak pointed at it without speaking. "You're not coming," Della said. "It wasn't a question." "I am not built for that kind of movement anymore," Arak said. He handed her the map folded precisely. "Also, the record is specific about who goes to the gate, the child, and one who carries the mark of passage." She looked at her palm. Arak said in the old Orc trade tongue, the phrase she recognized from settlement funeral ceremonies, the phrase that translated most closely as, "The ground knows your name, go with it." Then he went back inside. The maintenance tunnels under Precinct 9 were cold and smelled of minerals, and standing water and something beneath those odors that didn't have a name she could find. Something old, something pressurized. The flashlight pushed a cone of light through the dark, and the dark closed behind it, and Cor walked half a step behind her left shoulder, close enough that she could hear his breathing, steady and even, not the breathing of fear but the breathing of concentrated attention. At the first junction she checked the map. They turned left. At the second junction the map showed a vertical drop, accessed by iron rungs set into the wall, going down 2 levels. She went first, checking the rungs, finding them solid old iron, crusted with mineral deposit but structurally sound, bolted into stone that the city's builders had clearly found and used as a convenient anchor point without ever asking what it was. Cor came down after her, the tablet pressed between his chest and the wall, moving carefully and without complaint. The third level was different from the maintenance tunnels above, narrower. The walls here were not poured concrete or brick, but the same gray-black stone as the tablet and the walls of the deep settlement tunnels Cor had described. The floor was level and smooth in a way that didn't happen naturally. The flashlight beam showed the walls receding ahead of them in a corridor that was precisely the same width from left to right. Not the slightly uneven width of a man-made utility tunnel, but the precise, consistent width of something made with different tools and different standards. The first Sheth found them in the third junction. He came out of a side passage at a speed that human muscle wasn't built to produce, and Della was moving before her brain had fully processed the input, the training coming up through the adrenaline like something structural, something that existed below thought. She didn't fire. The tunnel was narrow and Cor was behind her, and the angles were bad, and gunfire in enclosed stone produced acoustic damage and disorientation that would cost more than it bought. She went forward instead of back. The Sheth warrior was larger than her by a significant margin, which was about what she'd expected. She used the size against him. Used the size and the narrow walls and the 4-pointed mark burned into his chest armor that told her he was ideologically committed in a way that made him predictable. Committed fighters had tells, had commitments of movement that looked like strength and functioned as limits. She'd learned this in the alley on Korath Street. She'd learned it the hard way, through her partner's forearm, but she'd learned it. When it was over, the warrior was down, and her shoulder was going to need attention, and Cor was standing exactly where she'd told him to stand, in the angle of the junction, where the geometry made him hardest to reach in a fast approach from either direction. He looked at the downed warrior without visible distress. Then he looked at Della. "You're bleeding," he said. The warrior's blade had caught her forearm, shallow but long. "It's fine," she said. She wrapped it with a strip from the field kit without stopping walking. "My grandmother said to expect interference," Cor said, keeping pace. "She said whatever is beyond the gate has had 200 years to make arrangements." How many arrangements? He considered this. She didn't know. She said the arrangements would be proportional to how close the gate was to collapse. She said the closer to collapse, the more the thing beyond it needed the gate to remain open, and the more it would put in the path of anyone trying to close it. And how close is the gate to collapse? 6 days ago the banner moved, he said. My grandmother said the banner moves when the gate enters its final season. She said the final season is not long. They went deeper. The fourth annotation on the survey was not a small thing. Della had pictured a cave, something intimate and low-ceilinged, the scale of secrets. What she found instead, at the end of the corridor where it simply opened outward into space, was a room. The word was insufficient. The space was hemispherical, its walls curving upward and inward from a floor of the same gray-black stone, its ceiling lost somewhere in a darkness her flashlight couldn't reach. The scale of it was wrong in the way that large underground spaces were always wrong. The mind resisted, insisted on smaller, adjusted reluctantly. The air was warmer here, warmer and pressurized slightly differently, the change subtle enough to register only as a mild adjustment of the ears. The floor was smooth. The walls were carved, floor to ceiling, in the same script as the tablet, but the scale was enormous, the characters each the size of a human head, running in continuous lines around the circumference without apparent start or end. In the center of the floor, standing vertical in the space as naturally as a line drawn in air, was the gate. Not a door shape, not an arch, a seam. A vertical seam in the air itself, approximately 2 meters tall and narrow enough to walk through only sideways, emanating a light that had no name in any color system she knew. Not white, not gold, not any spectrum she could identify. Her visual cortex reported it as light and simultaneously reported that something about it exceeded the category. It carried information her eyes could receive but her brain couldn't decode. It pressed against her eyes like a sustained low note presses against eardrums. Not painful, not quite comfortable, a physical fact requiring acknowledgement. From the seam came sound, not loud, not dramatic. A low, patient grinding, as of very large machinery at the far end of a long building, the sound of something massive and structural that had been running for a very long time without maintenance or pause. The sound of a machine built to last and outlasting its purpose and running still, because it was built to run. Cor stepped past her. She grabbed his shoulder. Wait. He turned and looked at her. In the light of the gate, his green eyes were extraordinary. They caught the light in a way that made them look less like eyes and more like the light's point of origin, as though the gate was the reflection and the boy was the source. She said, "Tell me what happens." "I told you I don't know." "Best guess, your grandmother's best guess." He was quiet. 7 years old in a room that was older than language, carrying a cracked stone tablet and a wrapped palm and 40 years of someone else's preparation. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, and then he said, "She said the gate will ask, not in words, in the way a wound asks. You'll understand what it needs when you're close enough to feel what it is." "And what does it need?" "The blood is the mechanism," he said. "But the mechanism isn't the point. The point is the agreement. The record says the closing requires a voluntary agreement from the bloodline, not just the blood but the understanding. She said the child 240 years ago had the blood and didn't fully understand the agreement. Didn't fully understand what was being agreed to." "What is being agreed to?" He looked at the gate. "That the door stays closed," he said. "Not just right now. That the Morath line agrees to close it and to keep it closed. That's why it has to be the bloodline. The gate was keyed to a bloodline at the beginning by the first presence so that the agreement would be inheritable, so that every generation of the line would carry the agreement forward." He paused. "My grandmother said she spent 40 years trying to find a way around this. She said there wasn't one. She said the first presence had been thorough." Behind them on the iron ladder came sound. More than one person descending. More than two. moving with the particular urgency of people who have run out of time for subtlety. Della turned. She faced the tunnel entrance, the flashlight angled low, and she measured the geometry. The entrance was narrow, one at a time. That was the only advantage the geometry offered. Cor said behind her, "Sergeant Morrow." The shift in his voice was something she felt before she heard it. Something in the acoustic quality of the room changed. Not the gates grinding, something else, something that emanated from the boy. As though the room had been waiting for him to speak, and now that he had, the room was paying attention. "I know what to do," he said. She kept her eyes on the tunnel entrance. "Do it." She heard him move toward the gate. And then she heard them come. The Sheth came fast, and they came committed, which was predictable, and they came in the assumption that fast and committed was sufficient, which was the thing about ideological fighters in confined spaces. They trusted the commitment to substitute for tactics. She shot the first one center mass, adjusted for the angle, and the second came over the first in the same moment, and she moved left, and the tunnel wall was there, and she used it, and her shoulder screamed from the earlier damage, and she shot the second one, and there were more. The Sheth were not unlimited, she knew this. Whatever arrangements had been made were proportional to what was available, and what was available in a maintenance tunnel 40 stories below a city precinct was a finite number of people, and people were finite, and she was not running out of herself, yet even if her ammunition was running down, and behind her from the direction of the gate came a sound. High and sustained, harmonic in a way that her inner ear registered as music even though it had no melody, and no rhythm, and no structure she could map to any acoustic category she knew. A single note sustained across dimensions of frequency she wasn't fully equipped to hear, increasing in some quality that wasn't volume and wasn't pitch, but was something adjacent to both. The way the gate's light was adjacent to visible light without being it. The Sheth in the tunnel stopped. All of them, she hadn't shot them. They stopped voluntarily, which was the wrong word for what she saw, because voluntary implied a decision, and what she saw on their faces wasn't decision. It was reception. They had received something. They stood in the tunnel entrance with the expressions of people who have just understood something that reorganizes everything they believed. Something so fundamental that the understanding didn't feel like new information, but like remembered information. Like something they'd known and forgotten and been given back. Then the gate sound stopped. All of it stopped. The grinding, the harmonic, the gate light, all of it cut at once, and in their place was a silence that was not the absence of sound but the presence of finishedness. The silence of a sentence that has ended correctly. The silence of a mechanism that has completed its cycle and found its rest. She turned. The gate was closed. The seam was still there, visible as a thin dark line in the air of the chamber, the way a healed wound is still visible as a seam in skin. No light, no grinding, no pressure in the eyes, just the dark mark of something that had been. Cor was standing in front of the seam with his right hand pressed flat against it. The tablet lay on the floor in two clean pieces, split precisely along its central crack, the handprint on the upper piece and the script on the lower. His right palm was bleeding through the field dressing, a slow seep, dark against the white fabric. He took his hand away from the seam. He looked at his palm. He looked at Della. "It worked," he said, not triumph. The specific exhaustion of someone who has finished a long preparation and is only now discovering what being done feels like. She holstered her weapon and crossed the chamber floor to him. She crouched down in front of him. His eyes were still his eyes, still green and steady and precise, but something in them was different in a way she couldn't name. Older, maybe, or more accurately, aware of being older, aware of what had just been agreed to. Behind her, the Sheth warriors in the tunnel entrance turned without speaking and walked back up the way they'd come, not running, not hurrying. Moving with the purposeful quiet of people who have been relieved of a weight they carried for so long they'd forgotten it was there, and who are only now, in its absence, feeling what it is to walk upright. "Are you hurt?" she said. He looked at his palm, just this. She pulled a fresh dressing from the kit and wrapped his hand, working carefully, the way she'd been trained, the way you did it for real wounds and not just in practice. Her hands were very steady. Cor watched her work. "She was right," he said. "Your grandmother." She said the knowing would come at the door. She said I would understand what was needed when I was close enough to feel what it was. He paused. There was a moment when I put my hand on the stone, and I felt the place where the other hand had been. The child who tried 240 years ago. I felt the shape of what they'd done and why it hadn't worked, and I understood what the difference needed to be. It was very simple. The difference was the agreement, not the blood. The blood is just the signature. The agreement is the content. She tried to give the gate what she had. I agreed to give the gate what it was asking for. He paused again. The gate was asking for the line, not just me. The whole remaining line, my children if I have them. Their children. The agreement runs forward. Della finished the wrapping. She sat back on her heels. The chamber was very still around them. Old stone, old script, the dark seam of the closed gate, the two pieces of the tablet on the floor. "What happens to you now?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "The settlement office will want to put you in a facility," she said. "I'm not going to let that happen. I want you to understand that." He looked at her. Why not? She thought about it. She thought about Aruck in the mail room with 40 years of knowledge that nobody had thought to ask about. She thought about her partner's arm and the use of force report that she'd filed, and that wouldn't capture any of what had actually happened in the alley on Koreth Street. Not the way the history of the gate would have explained it, if anyone had known the history. She thought about the settlement statistics that every report documented and no policy addressed, which now she understood differently. Not the result of industrial negligence or economic neglect alone, but the long, slow consequence of something geological, something pre-industrial, something that predated every institution that had ever tried to address it. She thought about what it would mean to change things now that she knew, what it would require. "Because you just did something no human institution is equipped to process," she said. "And the last thing a 7-year-old who just agreed to close a dimensional gate on behalf of his entire bloodline needs is to be processed." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother also said that the time after the door is harder than the door," he said. "She said the world doesn't rearrange itself just because you've done the necessary thing. She said you still have to do the work of explaining it to the world, and that the world is not naturally receptive to explanations of things it has no category for." Della stood up. She picked up the two pieces of the tablet and put them in her jacket pockets. She pointed her flashlight at the iron ladder. "We'll start with that," she said. "Come on." He came. They went back up through the maintenance tunnel. The 7-year-old orc child with his wrapped hands and his green eyes and his measured steps, and the human police sergeant with a bad shoulder and 6 years of settlement experience, and a scar on her palm and a very clear understanding, now, of why the scar had always seemed to be shaped like something, even when she couldn't say what. Above them the city continued. Traffic, phones, the settlement division argument, the booking printer's complaint, the ordinary machinery of institutions that had not been asked to reckon with what had happened below their foundations, and that would need to be asked, and that would resist the asking, and that would eventually, slowly, grudgingly, in the way institutions did things, begin to reckon. The health statistics in the outer settlements would not change overnight. The communities that had been living next to the gate's leakage for 2 generations would not recover in a season. There were reports to be written and policies to be challenged, and arguments to be had in offices with people who had never set foot east of the refinery line, and the arguments would be long, and the offices would be resistant, and progress would be slower than the problem deserved. But the grinding had stopped. 40 stories below the city, in a chamber that the city's geological surveys had abandoned as too deep to measure, the gate that had been leaking for 200 years was closed. The seam was dark. The mechanism was done. That was the beginning. That was what you could point to and say, here, from here. Della helped core up the last rungs of the iron ladder, back into the maintenance tunnels, back into the cold smell of minerals in ordinary dark. First, she said, we're going to get you something warm to eat. I know a place 2 blocks from the precinct that does good settlement-style food and doesn't ask questions. All right, he said. Then I'm going to call a woman named Talus, who runs a legal advocacy office for settlement miners. She's sharp, and she's unafraid of fights with the settlement office, and she'll have thoughts. All right. And at some point, I have to explain all of this to my watch commander, who is going to be extremely unhappy, and file a report that describes what happened in this building today in terms that don't get me put on administrative leave, which is going to require some significant linguistic creativity. Core considered this. My grandmother said that the hardest part of necessary things is often the paperwork. Della stopped walking. She looked at him. The green eyes were steady. Something in his expression was very close to humor. Smart woman, she said. Yes, he said, she was. They walked. The tunnel ran ahead of them in the flashlight beam, ordinary and clear, no surprises left in it, just the straightforward distance between where they were and where they needed to be. The city above them didn't know what had changed. The city above them would have to learn. That was fine. It was survivable. Most necessary things were, it turned out, once you were on the other side of them. Della kept the flashlight steady and they kept moving, and the door behind them was closed, and the grinding had stopped, and there was a long road ahead, and they were already on it, which was, as the grandmother had apparently known for a very long time, the only way anything ever got started. They had soup at a place called Nara's, 2 blocks from the precinct, in a booth in the back where nobody looked at them twice. The proprietor was an older settlement woman who'd been running the place for 30 years and who, when Della had first started working the settlement boundary, had told her that the best thing a city cop could do for the outer districts was learn to sit down and eat a meal in them. Della had taken the advice. It had been the best professional development of her career. Nara brought the soup herself. She looked at Core with the careful, assessing look of someone who had seen a great many things and was taking her time deciding what this was. She set the soup in front of him. She said something in the deep settlement Orc dialect, soft and quick. Core answered. Nara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at his wrapped hand. Then she looked at Della. She said in standard, I'll bring more bread. She brought more bread. She refilled the water without being asked. She did not come back to the table after that, which was the most respectful thing she could have done. Core ate with the same methodical precision that Della was beginning to understand was simply how he did things. Not in the way of someone performing carefulness, but in the way of someone who had been taught that attention was a form of respect, that doing things carefully was not a style but a practice. He ate the soup. He ate most of the bread. He drank all of the water. When he was done, he folded his hands on the table and looked at her. What happens to the settlement health effects? He said. My grandmother said the gates closing would change the geology over time, but she didn't know how much time. I don't know either, Della said. Probably it'll take years. Probably the improvements will be slow enough that nobody will point to a specific cause. The city will write more reports. Will the reports get it right this time? Della thought about this honestly. Some of them might, she said. With the right people asking the right questions. It's not a guarantee. Nothing in this kind of work is a guarantee. It's more like, you make the necessary things happen, and then you spend the rest of your time arguing with the institutions about whether the necessary thing happened, and what it means, and whose budget it falls under. Core was quiet for a moment. My grandmother liked to say that institutions are just people who have stopped asking why. That's a very precise description, Della said. I'm going to write that down. Something in his expression shifted slightly. the way it had when he'd made the joke about the paperwork, a small controlled warmth, not a full smile, but the architecture of one. She thought about what he'd told her in the chamber, about the agreement the gate had taken, that every future generation of the Morath line would carry it forward. She thought about being 7 years old and having that understand come into you, not as a burden exactly, but as a structure, something load-bearing that you would live inside for the rest of your life. She said, "How do you feel?" He thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about everything. "Different," he said, "not heavier. Different in the way that places are different after weather has passed through them. The weather is gone and the place is the same, but also recognizably changed. There's a word for this in the old tongue. My grandmother used it once. She said she'd been waiting her whole life to find out what the word felt like from the inside." Della called Talus from outside the restaurant while Cor sat at the booth and watched through the window, his wrapped hands folded on the table. Talus answered on the second ring, which was how Talus answered everything, because Talus believed that calls taken on the first ring communicated excess eagerness, and calls taken on the third ring communicated disorganization. Della said, "I have a situation that's going to require more legal creativity than I currently possess." "Those are my favorite situations," Talus said. "Tell me." Della told her. Not everything, not the gate, not the chamber, not the sound that the closing had made, but the essential outline. Orc child, no guardian, no family marker, deep settlement origin, in the custody of a precinct that was going to try to root him through juvenile processing. Significant cultural and legal considerations that the standard settlement juvenile protocols were not equipped to address. Talus asked 4 questions. All 4 questions were the right questions. She said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't let anyone put him in the system before I arrive." "Understood," Della said. "And Morrow," Talus said before she hung up, "the thing you're not telling me. Is the child safe?" Della looked through Nara's window at the boy sitting at the booth, eating a second piece of bread that Nara had left without comment. His green eyes were on the window, on her, steady and precise. "Yes," she said, "the child is safe." She went back inside. She sat across from Cor. Someone is coming who will help. She knows the settlement juvenile law better than anyone in the city, and she is extremely difficult to dismiss or redirect. "Good," Cor said. "Until she gets here, we wait." He nodded. He looked at the table. He said, without looking up, "My grandmother said she hoped she would be there. At the end. She said she'd spent 40 years preparing me for something she wouldn't get to see." The restaurant was quiet. From the kitchen came the sounds of Nara's work, ordinary and continuous. The sounds of someone who had decided long ago what their contribution to the long argument was, and had been making it every day since. "She got to see more than she knew," Della said. Cor looked at her. "She got to see you," Della said. "Everything she prepared you to be, she got to see. The preparation was the witness. The getting ready is what she saw, and it was enough because it worked. What you were prepared for, you were ready for. That's the thing she got to see." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought she'd said the wrong thing. Then he said quietly, "She said the same thing, about her own teacher who didn't live to see the banner year. She said the teaching is the seeing." Sounds like she was right. "She was usually right," he said. Then, after a moment, "I don't know if I will be." "About what?" "About being a good steward of the agreement. The gate is closed. The agreement runs forward. I don't know yet what that means in practice. I don't know what the Morath line's responsibility looks like, with the gate closed, in a world that's going to go on not knowing the gate existed." Della thought about this. "You probably figure it out as you go," she said. "You make contact with whoever in the deep settlement still carries the knowledge. You find out what the record says about the after. You build the things you need. You do the work of explaining to the world like your grandmother said." and you live your life, which is also allowed. She said that too, he said, the almost smile returning. She said the agreement doesn't require me to be exclusively a steward. She said I was also allowed to just be 7. Good, Della said. 7 is a reasonable thing to be. They sat in Nara's until Talus arrived, which was 28 minutes, because Talus was also usually right about things. She came in with a briefcase and a very specific expression, and she sat down and she looked at Kor for a long moment and said, in excellent deep settlement dialect, a formal greeting that acknowledged his lineage without specifying it, which was the correct form for someone who knew they were in the presence of a specific orc bloodline but didn't know which one. Kor answered in kind. His eyes tracked to Della. Della said, I'll explain the details later. Right now I just need him safe and out of the Precinct 9 processing system. Already working on it, Talus said, opening the briefcase. Outside Nara's window, the city moved in its ordinary way. Traffic, people, the distant sounds of the settlement boundary at its regular operation. The afternoon light was coming at an angle that caught the refinery smoke on the eastern skyline and turned it amber, the way it did every day at this hour, the color of something burning that had been burning long enough to be mistaken for natural. That would change. Not today, not this season, probably not this year. But the source was closed, and the long, slow geology of the world would work on what remained, as geology always did, patient and indifferent to schedules. The health statistics would shift. Gradually, measurably, eventually, if the right people measured. The city would write a report. Maybe this time someone would read the right section. Kor was watching the city through the window, with those green eyes that missed nothing. He had closed the door at the bottom of the world. He had done the thing the banner had announced for his entire lifetime, the thing his grandmother had prepared him for with 40 years of specific, serious attention. He had pressed his bleeding palm against a seam in the air and made the agreement that his bloodline would carry forward, and the grinding had stopped, and the light had gone out, and the room was still. Now he was eating bread in a restaurant 2 blocks from a police precinct, watching the city that didn't know about him, and he was 7 years old, and he was allowed to be, and he was. That was enough. That was, as it turned out, exactly enough. The door was closed. The agreement was made. The work ahead was long and necessary and difficult and survivable, and they were already in it, and the bread was good, and outside the city went on, and somewhere below it, 400 meters down in the dark, the stone was still.